audio question recorded on YouTube, just saying we can turn it off temporarily. That's fine.
Start the screen. Start now.
Start the stream, yes. Okay. Do I need to introduce Cristiano now? Yes, for our viewers. Okay. Hello, everyone that is joining us digitally at the Food History Seminar tonight. We are delighted to have as our first paper Cristiano Turbil from UCL and the what's the department? SDS department at UCL. And you're going to talk to us tonight about the science in the kitchen. Please begin.
Thank you so much. First of all, do you mind if I stand? Because it really work much better for me if I can speak and gesticulate properly as an Italian. As I was saying, I'm an historian, so today I'm going to deliver a paper about the medical and cultural history of food into the Italian kitchen, and how food knowledge was actually used as a political attempt to create the first generation of Italian. Can you hear me well over there? Fantastic. Now, one of the things we always consider about Italy when we think about Italy in after the unification in 1861 is to talk about a unified country, a country that shares certain tradition, a country that shares a common language, a country that presents some aspects that actually are very similar across the whole peninsula. Well, that was not the case. Actually, a very famous sentence pronounced by Massimo d'Azeglio, and we are immediately after the unification, where he claimed that we have done Italy, but now we are not doing enough to make Italian. So what I'm going to do in this paper, I'm going to actually cover one aspect of my current research project, which I'm to write a political and medical history of post-unified Italy, working around this concept of making the first generation of Italian. Of course, it is involved a variety of venue, which include, of course, a discourse about race, a discourse about creating scientific and medical literacy, creating industry from the country, modernizing, for example, hospital, medical faculties, and everything around those things, but also involve very practical aspects, like, for example, what Italians eat, how to create a proper system of taxation around food, but also how to bring all of those concepts together to create a sense of national identity. In particular, today, I will focus my work on two figures. On the one hand, we have a Paolo Mantegazza, one of probably the most controversial scientists and medical doctor in post-unified Italy. Is the father of Italian hygiene. Is the first one that started writing about sexual medicine. Is very interested in neurotic food, so all of those food that can stimulate the brain. But is also the father of popular medicine in Italy. I will talk a little bit more about this later on, but is the one that invented and put onto the market the first example of book specifically designed to make Italian doctor at home. This involves, of course, a lot of material about food. On the other hand, we have a completely different figure. He's not a medical doctor. He's actually a literati man, Pellegrino Artusi, who is the father of the Italian culinary tradition, who published in 1891 this extremely famous book called La Scienza in Cucina, where for the first time Italian recipes were actually brought and put together in a sort of national sense, within a specific national tradition in mind. I want to be very specific of this. I'm not claiming that Artusi was actually creating Italian recipe. What I'm saying is that in his work, for the first time, he collects recipe from the Italian tradition, especially from the north, but we're going to get onto this in a second, and publish a book that will be later on widely read for a few generations across the peninsula. But how can we actually look at the work of those two figures and try to analyze the work in a kind of historical and history of medicine perspective? Well, my claim today, and what I would like to do, is to try to tell three stories at once. First, I would like to tell a story about Italy and its unification. Second, there is a story about diet and about food knowledge and how those two were becoming more and more important for Italian. Third and finally, there is a story about science, medicine, and public health, where concepts like diet, food composition and health were start to be taken into serious account, not only by medical doctor, but also by politician. In order to fully understand the work of those two figures, I think it's important to start with some context. As I was saying at the beginning, we know that Italy was become unified in 1861, but when we look at certain particular aspect across the peninsula, like for example the ability to read of the population, we notice huge discrepancy not only between the city and the rural area, but also between the north and the south. Let me just give you an example. In Milan, for example, looking at statistics, we have around 40% of the population that was able to read at the time. When we move on to a rural area, this number dropped. But when we move to the south of Italy, and especially in Sicily and Sardinia, in the rural area over there, the percentage of population able to actually have access to a written market of books actually dropped down to 4%. So we have huge differences. Other different were, of course, important were about access to certain service. I can make an argument here, but I'm not going to focus on this today, about, for example, medicine, hospital, and medical knowledge. But what is interesting and will be the key aspect of today's paper is about Italian food, access to this type of food, distribution, production, and the sanitary condition of Italian in different areas, so both within the main city, but also in rural area. Now, one of the things we know is that from the beginning, from immediately after the unification, the government put particular attention on tackling the problem of food distribution, access to food, and in general, question concerning malnutrition. This was a particular problem, especially in the rural area where the main job was agriculture. We have several interesting primary sources that provide us with kind of quite shocking data about this situation. One example among the many, in the 1870s, we have a report written by a politician and agronomist from Bologna called Luigi Tanari, which conducted a survey about the access to food and culinary tradition of the rural area in his region. And he provided us with two shocking, kind of partially shocking information. First of all, is the fact that in that area, the majority of the food that was consumed actually come from food production like baking on unrefined grain. We don't have often fresh vegetable on the table of a working class family, and meat, or in general protein, they tend to be quite not present on the table apart from a specific moment, like for example for specific celebration like Christmas or Easter. Now, there is another aspect that is actually quite shocking, and this comes from another type of source, from the Italian Royal Journal of Public Health, which started publishing from the late 1870s a series of reports and information about the effect that malnutrition had actually on the general healthy condition of Italian. So they identify three key problems. The first one is in relation to general malnutrition and disease produced or helped by this malnutrition. So we have data about, for example, cretinism or other disease that were believed to be not produced but supported by that malnutrition. We have a lot of data, for example, about the problem generated by alcoholism. Is actually when we look at a table published by doctor at the time, there was this kind of belief that the consumption of wine was actually a very, very good substitute of protein in the diet. And when we look at specific information, we can say that in the 1870, the average consumption per head for Italian of wine was around 137 liters a year. So kind of an impressive number. And then of course we have pellagra, so this disease that of course is produced by a lack of one particular vitamin that was particularly common in area where of course, the diet was mostly based on the consumption of corn and byproduct of corn like polenta. I'm not going to get too much into those details, but we need to consider that those were key problems, especially in a country where there was a clear political idea that want to modernize the country, to make Italian healthier, to make Italian more productive, and to create an healthy environment where the first generation of Italian could actually start producing and bringing Italy at the same level of other nations, like for example Germany or France. Now, is it in this context that is important to take a look at the work of Mantegazza and Artusi? As I was saying, there are two quite different figures. Mantegazza is a very controversial figure. I would say father of sexual medicine. Is the one that tried to introduce in Italy the consumption of various neurotic food. He published over 1,500 he had over 1,500 publications during his lifetime. He was a senator of the kingdom for over 30 years, so a very active figure. On the other hand, we have a man of letters that actually spent most of his life in the commerce. He lived in Florence, and then in the last part of his life he produced this amazing book, La Scienza in Cucina, which became extremely successful and clearly influenced Italian and their approach to food, especially in the 20th century. As I was saying, one of the key aspects we need to take into account in analyzing their work is the political dimension of what they were trying to do. And this political dimension, this political overlap between on the one hand, the necessity to embrace new medical and scientific idea, but also at the same time the need to bring those ideas to Italian. Mantegazza was in this respect extremely famous because he's one of the first that suggest to start thinking about science in a political perspective, to start thinking about science as not something that belonged to idea from the left or from the right, but belonged to the nation. In other words, to provide funding to science. At the same time, Mantegazza was also an individual that strongly believed that scientists had to go out from the laboratory and museum and to become apostle of communicate science to the masses. These, as I was saying, involve a variety of aspects, but among those aspects, food was, of course, central. If we take a look at the main publication produced by Mantegazza, Elementi di Igiene 1864, large part of the volume was actually organized around digestion, and they needed to understand how the stomach works, the effect that the food has on the stomach, and consequently how the consumption of specific type of food can motivate citizens to work better in certain situations, to be more productive in others. Mantegazza became an advocate of this material by start explaining to Italian the importance of start considering different type of food and the kind of benefit a diet based on specific product could have, not only on the life of the individual, but also on the life of the nation. How he did that? Well, actually, in a variety of ways. He produced, of course, manuscript to be sent out to the scientific community, but he also started publishing those interesting book called Almanacchi Igienico Popolari, which I will call from now on the almanacs. Under 50-page long books designed to popular audience, they had one simple mission in mind. The idea to make Italian doctor at home. So they provide specific guidelines, for example, in relation to food, on how to preserve food, on how to cook food, specific advice about the hygiene to keep in the kitchen, on how to, for example, drink a specific type of alcohol or specific type of neurotic food in order to the job this individual was doing, in order to the type of goal he wanted to achieve. What is interesting is that in any of those publications, Mantegazza always provide specific detail about the composition of different type of food, trying to explain to Italian how, if you want, for example, to acquire, I'm sorry, it's all in Italian, but if you want to get a certain percentage of protein from a dish, you need to select one type of meat. If you, for example, if you suffer for difficulty of digestion, you need to avoid a certain type of food. If you want to drink a specific type of beverage, or if you want to think about the bread you eat in terms of, for example, of the percentage of gluten we need, you can compare the production of different bread in different cities, not only on a national level, but even on a European level. What is also interesting is that Mantegazza arrived to the point to explain for the first time to Italian and try to introduce into the Italian diet the use of neurotic food. Those involved consumption of coffee, different type of alcohol, but also all the way up to chewing coca leaf in order to help Italian to work harder and longer. He actually, that's kind of a joke, but it's reported in his in one of his notes. He even wanted to introduce the consumption of coca leaf inside the Italian parliament, especially to help during very, very long, boring discussion. Now, what can we say about this? Well, the importance of his work, of course, was not simply a matter of presenting those medical and public health information to Italian. His work was mostly political. It was political because, especially in the popular book, he always put those information next to specific advice about how it's important to come together as a nation. So, for example, he wrote an almanac called Dictionary of Italian Food, in which he explore and explain and provide anecdote about all of the different products all of the different food you can buy on an Italian market, from anchovies to a different type of bread, and with the message that although different, and although just eaten in different area, they actually made us all together Italian. Also, let me just provide you with another detail. For example, in almanacs, when he talks about the consumption of neurotic food, he dedicates a chapter about the consumption of alcohol. And in that chapter, although he provides again to specific detail about the percentage of alcohol in different spirit, his message was mostly political and moral. He wanted to convince the citizen that a good citizen is a good citizen because he knows how to measure himself and stop drinking when it's not necessary. When a bad citizen that he compared like a beast, he described as the individual that get back home drunk and cannot contribute to the economy of his family and consequently the general economy of the nation. Now, of course, as I was saying, Mantegazza was presenting his work all across the nation, and also present his work in Florence, because he got his main position as a professor in anthropology and medicine, actually, at the University of Florence, and it's there where he met, or had the chance to meet, my other figure, Pellegrino Artusi. I still have... Fantastic. Pellegrino Artusi, a completely different figure, completely different type of publication. His aim was not to make Italian doctor at home like Mantegazza, but his work was equally important, both from a political, also from a cultural, but also from a medical perspective. As I was saying, Artusi published this book called La Scienza in Cucina in 1891. The first edition included 490 recipes. During the life of the author, this book was published and was revised another 2 times, and his final edition, the 3rd edition, it included over 700 recipes and specific, and that's what I found quite interesting of his work, specific hygienic advice on how to preserve food, on how to cook food, and the importance, and I will get onto this in a second, of consuming local, fresh, and varied product. So when it comes to the selection of recipe, as I was saying at the beginning, Artusi doesn't put together recipe from all across the nation. Most of the recipe actually come from the area where we live, but his work, I think, is particularly revolutionary because for the first time we can talk about Italian recipe, we can talk about Italian cooking, we can talk about a national collection of a recipe. What I found interesting of that book is the fact that it focused around three key themes. The first one is, as I was saying, hygiene, so the importance of improving the hygiene not only within the kitchen but within the life of the individual, so to teach Italian to have a very varied diet, to not just eat specific product, to not consume too much wine, but actually to try to have a balance and well-organized diet throughout the year. The second aspect, of course, economy. So is the necessity and the advice to buy local and seasonal food, so to not rely, for example, that food that comes from other area maybe, or meat that has been preserved in salt, to kind of completely change the habit, especially of middle and working class. And finally, buon gusto, good taste. So bringing to Italian tasty and healthy recipe that can make them discover the amazing journey that actually can be brought to your palate by cooking actually complex recipe with simple ingredient. Now, as I was saying, there is quite a lot of work on Artusi, but most of the paper I had the chance to read, they tend to focus on the linguistic and cultural dimension of his work. It's something that we need to recognize because Artusi, he creates a language for food. He promotes finally a language that was not just regional, but it became national. However, and I think this is something that we really need to take into account, his work was much more than that. His work was an attempt to try to tackle those problems, as I was mentioning at the beginning, to try to tackle those problems of malnutrition, of difficult access to food, of bad condition of the Italian kitchen, of problem in having a very well and organized Italian diet. Let me just provide you a couple of examples. The book contains plenty of variety of recipe, and all of those recipes, although they are written in a kind of a very, very simple and accessible form, they always provide a specific, basic medical advice. One case among the many, there is a section when Artusi talks about the minestrone, so a classic Italian vegetable soup. And what does it tell us about the minestrone? Well, it tells us that the minestrone is a very good dish, but is a dish that we need to consume only, for example, if it's in the evening and we need a light meal. Because we cannot base our diet, especially if we work outside, if we work, for example, in the field and we need a lot of energy, is not good enough to just base our diet on the simple consumption of a vegetable soup. And of course, as I was saying before, adding the use of wine for additional calorie. So the whole book is written in such a way that provide, on the one hand, information and about a possible Italian diet, a possible Italian recipe, the importance of consuming specific type of product, but on the other hand, is full of those little advice that can really serve Italian in order to basically resolve some more problem into life. Very basic but very useful, almost like as Mantegazza was doing with his almanacs, less scientific but very much practical, very much key to the household. Another example that I always found fascinating is from the second edition onward, Artusi start actually including a selection of not only of recipe but of potential meals, and he start introducing meals about that you can eat in different months or different days in the year. And one of the things that is actually amazing is the attention he paid on the seasonality of the product and give a specific advice to the reader to either, if it's summer, collect it yourself from your vegetable garden or go to your local market. This is something that it's kind of revolutionary, especially when we see in the context of this kind of general lack of information about the importance of a balanced and very well organized diet. I'm actually coming to a conclusion, but let me say that what is important here is to consider La Scienza in Cucina, and more broadly also the publication of Mantegazza, not just a medical book, but actually as a mix between a cultural, a medical, and a political publication. I think that in the case of Mantegazza Almanacs and of course Artusi La Scienza in Cucina, the idea was not just to provide information about science, but culturally bring Italians together, give them a common ground, teach them something that can, of course, improve their knowledge of science, but also make them feel part of a nation. I think that their work fulfilled the idea brought by modernity that politics and science should cooperate and overlap. And I think that in their endeavor to create a distinctively Italian culinary tradition, Mantegazza and Artusi were both communicators of science and medicine, but also politicians. They were the quintessential positivists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristiano. We'll do about 10-12 minutes of questions before we move on, but I'm sure we'll have lots, and I've got several, but we'll start with everyone else so I don't use up anyone else's. What's that? Daniela?
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentation. I knew the work of Artusi, I didn't know the one of Paolo Mantegazza. And actually my question is if you can tell us a little bit more about the intersection between these two figures. So what do we know about Paolo Mantegazza meeting Artusi, or is it just likely that they knew each other's work? Did they work together?
They didn't work together, but Artusi was commonly used to go to the public talk delivered by Mantegazza in Florence. So we have a report of those talks in Artusi autobiography, where he described attending those Mantegazza was delivering a lot of public lecture. It was something he believed into. He believed in science in the public square. So he was used to do that. And of course, teaching and living in Florence, this is something that was doing quite often over there. And Artusi was one of those individuals that often used to go and attend. Now, there is some basic interaction between the two, so we know they were used to talk, they were used to discuss. We don't have information about any potential collaboration. However, there is a very interesting letter that actually was published in the 1910 edition of La Scienza in Cucina by the late Mantegazza's wife, which actually write a very welcoming letter to Artusi to celebrate the new edition and to just say how much his late husband was probably going to be proud not only of his work but of the reference that Artusi put on Mantegazza in his work.
Thank you.
I was wondering, continuing on from that, how much is known about the reception of Mantegazza's almanacs in sort of amongst I guess the wider society, Italian society then, because it strikes me as definitely a more academic approach and more scientific. And I wonder, especially considering like the literacy rates you were talking about and things at the time, how accessible that stuff was.
Well, thank you so much for the question. It's kind of a little bit of a long story to tell. I will try to summarize, but there are two factors. So if we take a look at scientific publication in Italy, in 1861 we are around 100 publications a year. If we take a look at the turn of the century, we are around 800 publications a year. So there is a clear increase. What was clear of the almanacs, which let me say they were not in no way successful as Artusi's book, they were easily accessible. They were sold in the public market for a very cheap price. Mantegazza was actually using quite a few interesting trick in his publication. So, for example, he always sell them before Christmas. He always include a calendar in them with specific advice on the specific period of the year. So they sold quite well, but not as well as Artusi, which his work in the very early 20th century reached over 200,000 copies sold, which is beyond impressive for a culinary book.
Okay, you saw that then? Yeah, I think so.
I was wondering if you could sort of say a little bit more about the hygiene practices that were mentioned in Artusi's work. How did he frame them? How did he get them in?
Like a specific basic advice that drop here and there. So it's not written in a kind of well-organized way, because we have, for example, recipe where there is not at all any advice, there is just some historical anecdote, but in relation to some recipe, or when he talks about some product, always kind of drop those little hygienic advice. So there is a section when he talks about preservation of food and say, but you should always keep your house with a temperature above 12 degrees. This is good, especially if you have kids. Or there is a section when he talks about eggs, where he suggests that, I went to a lecture to this professor of physiology, Professor Maurice Skiff at the University of Florence, that was explaining the difference between the two components of the eggs, so to explain which one has a better effect on digestion of the stomach. So when you cook, you should use one, but you should exclude the other if you experience those type of symptoms. So it's not everywhere, but throughout the book you find several.
Thank you very much. So I didn't really picture in the question in my mind, so forgive me, but I'm trying to do it now. We've said that the Italians were eating quite unhealthily. At least the working class was eating quite unhealthily when Italy got together in 1961. But Italy is very known for Mediterranean cuisine. So is this a product of, is it something that was already there, or is it a product of this sort of education of the country?
Well, the thing is, I see exactly the point you're making, and as I was saying at the beginning, they are not changing the Italian cuisine in terms of the traditional food that exists in traditional place. Okay, so Artusi was not explaining and say, look, we can do a tortellino in this way, or we can do a bolognese sauce, although it doesn't call it bolognese sauce, in that particular way. What he actually does is to try to explain to Italian how we have a specific set of recipe that we can call them Italian recipe. We have a body of knowledge that can be called Italian culinary tradition. When it comes to access to food, totally correct, but one of the things we need to take into account is that there are certain areas, especially in the north, in the Pianura Padana, where there is not that there is access to a very limited, not only amount of food, but also type of food. And this is quite clear when we take a look at the problem related to pellagra, which is mostly based on two factors. One is that there is a diet that relies too much on the consumption of corn, but on the other hand, the problem is related to the general ignorance, or ignorance is not the right word, it's lack of knowledge about the importance of not just consuming that food, and to integrate the diet with other products, like for example proteins. And we have the same problem with alcoholism, because alcoholism, there was this kind of false belief in the 19th century that actually drinking wine was sort of seen as this kind of extremely beneficial dietary component that can provide you with all of those calories that your diet was going to lack otherwise. Did I answer your question?
Yes, maybe I'll ask you something later, but I don't want to.
Okay.
Can I just ask how successful they actually were they were successful in them being brought the books, by the sounds of it, but were they successful in changing the diets? Did people actually do the recipes, pay attention to the health advice? How can you tell?
Let me tell you just, if you take a look at information about consumption of wine, we're still around 100 litres in the mid-20th century. Again, I think they were successful in the way of spreading that knowledge, but the knowledge was successful especially for middle class. It was not successful for the working class. For a variety of reasons. As I was saying, working class probably they were not able to afford those books, to read those books. So there is an attempt to do so. But it's not a full, it depends. It's successful in relation to different
some groups, yeah, okay. And I suppose with the middle class, there's an aspirational element to that as well, that they want to be seen to be sort of following Italian traditions and so forth. So that's part of the reason why they might be more keen as well on this. Yeah. Thanks.
So my question is, I'm curious about like where this concept of seasonal and local and fresh food coming from, like of these two guys, because traditionally you eat a lot of preserved food. And now when we talk about local and seasonal, it's very common. But I'm just like wondering where, like 100, 200 years ago, where this guy got this idea?
Well, first of all, I mean, which is actually a quite interesting question, because if we think in the case of Mantegazza published books on how to preserve food. But also it's part of this attempt to understand the nutritional value of the food. And of course, when you start, conducting and measuring the nutritional value of a specific type of food, you also recognize that preserved food, in certain respect, is less nutritional than fresh food. Let me just give you another example. Mantegazza at some point is involved by a governmental inquiry. So the government want to tax the consumption of salt, the use of salt in baking. Okay, so he asked Mantegazza to go all around the country to take a look at the various baking traditions. So, and in particular, how much salt they use in baking bread. So these show him not only about how baking actually is radically different across the peninsula, but also give them this kind of political idea of trying to do something in terms of taxation that it can be equally beneficial for the whole country. And as a part of this understanding of the economy of food, and I think that to a certain extent it really pushed Mantegazza toward the idea of trying to make the most of what you produce. So trying to make the most of the local, trying to make the most of the seasonal food. Of course, we cannot think about this in the way we think about this now, but I think it's mostly in terms of economy and in terms of practicality.
I haven't asked a question yet, but I spotted on one of his slides that he compared different types of milk, and he actually compared human breast milk, right, to cow's milk, etc.
Okay, yes, Mantegazza was a bit weird. I mean, just
had to point it out.
let me just tell you something. Mantegazza is also the first one, and we are in the 1870 that proposed the idea of creating a national sperm bank, because he started conducting experiment on trying to preserve human sperm in ice. So he brought to the government to say, in order to kind of save the potential offspring of soldier, we should implement this system that I studied, where we preserve it in ice and we can post it all around the country. So he's a very controversial figure. And so if you find a detail like this, if you get the chance to read Mantegazza, especially his anthropological book, don't be surprised.
It was slightly misogynist, perhaps.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Another round of applause, please, Cristiano.
Thank you so much.
So we're going to do a little swap around now. Is that okay? Daniela?
Here you go.
It wasn't
Okay, we're all settled. Fantastic. So for the second half of our session, we are staying geographically in the same place, but we are moving a little bit forward in time. Daniela Pirani from University of Liverpool is going to talk to us about when brands invent tradition, and we'll talk about Italian breakfast. So please
Thank you. Maybe I'll stand as well. It has something to do with Italians, not being able to sit down. I'm really pleased to present my work here because I am actually, my background is in food studies, but then I took a PhD. I did a PhD in marketing and sociology, and I realized that deep within my heart, I want to be a business historian. So I'm doing a bit of marketing historical research, and this is the outcome of what I've been working on. And this actually is a bit of an offspring of my PhD. So for those running a PhD now, be aware, it's full of surprises out there. You can get to places where you were not thinking to go. Anyway, so today what I want to focus on is the interplay between the marketplace and the media in creating tradition. That I'm using inventing, but we're talking a lot about reinventing or giving new meanings. And especially what I'll be talking about today is breakfast, which is, probably you'll be bored about it by the end of the presentation, but it's a very interesting topic because it's heavily understudied in the history of Italian food, and I would say in terms of gastronomy in general. So my argument of today is that the marketplace shifted considerably with the advent of this Italian brand that I'll be talking to you about, and that this brand named Mulino Bianco, white mill, managed to reinvent a new idea of breakfast by innovating the actual product, so biscuits. And yes, we do have a it looks like they're paying me, but they're not. It's very unfortunate. And by inventing a legitimizing narrative. The data I'll be presenting today come from several archives of bakery brands, especially the archive of this brand here, but also from the archive of an Italian publisher, Mondadori. So, and a lot of literature on bakery and biscuit across the world. So to begin with, I need to convince you that Italian breakfast is indeed a tradition. So when we talk about, when we talk about Italian breakfast, we think about convenience bakery products, milk and coffee. This is actually a picture coming from a magazine in the 90s. And maybe some of you visiting Italy, especially if you've had domestic breakfast at home, so domestic breakfast actually were probably offered this kind of scene. And to convince you that there is such a thing as a traditional Italian breakfast, I am reading you a couple of lines from the guidelines for an healthy Italian nutrition. These are the ones available now in the government website, but they have actually come from 2003. They've not been updated. We don't need it. Consumers should prefer sweets with a low fat content and with complex carbohydrates, bakery products of the Italian tradition, such as biscuits and dry cakes. So there is the implication that these biscuits and dry cakes belong to our tradition. More recently, there has been a research run in 2014 by DOXA on the food habits of migrants, so people who migrate to Italy, and actually the adoption of a sweet uncooked breakfast based on these kind of products was read as a sign of integration within Italian culture. However, when we start questioning, okay, but when this Italian breakfast started and how did it come, we have, and especially how do we get to having biscuits as part of the Italian tradition, things get a bit muddy. And I'm glad that Cristiano presented first, because I read a bit of the Artusi as well, and he mentions breakfast, saying how having buttered bread in the morning is a sign of an healthy diet. But then when we actually start looking into cookery books or recipe books in general, there's very little mention of what was eaten at breakfast in general. And overall, I would say that one of the issues is trying to understand how the bakery industry evolved, because the data on bakery industry usually include bread. So it's bread plus biscuits plus everything else. And as you can tell, it's quite different to think about biscuits and to think about bread evolution. So these data are actually quite interesting also in terms of trying to split the history of this kind of bakery production, convenience bakery production, to the history of bread in the Italian tradition. So I would love to talk to you about the history of Italian biscuits, but that's a whole other chapter. I can just let you know for now that till like, let's say 1950s, so early 60s, biscuits used to be a product used for middle class, for two occasions basically: middle class hospitality, and this was considered like still the tea or biscuits offered to guests who would come and visit, and this was one. And the second occasion of consumption was specialty products for children or for people that needed a special nutrition. So biscuits were considered very nutritious products, very nutritious food items. And this, I apologize for the poor quality of the image. This is an advertising from 1953, if I'm correct, of Manitoba biscuit. And you can see the toddlers competing for the biscuits. And this actually reflects quite well the nature of the market. And to give you a little bit of understanding, when we talk about biscuits, it's quite important to divide in 4 categories. There are the commercial ones, and it's dry biscuits, frollini, which is a lighter version of shortbreads, basically, egg biscuits, and wafers. And while like dry biscuits were mainly part of the nutrition of children, because they were considered really close to bread and thus really easy to digest, talking about that sort of a hygiene of digestion. While of course products such as wafers were considered like more suitable for special occasions. When we start, of course, like as every other industry in Italy, with the industrial boom, we do have an increase in biscuit production. So we know, for instance, that between the 1957 and 1967, the overall biscuit production doubled. And because of this, biscuits start to become much more everyday accessible products. And by 1967, the biscuits are the 78 of the bakery market, and by that I mean a convenience product. I'm not including bread, of course. And this is a lovely, I love documents. It's one of the documents from the archive that shows the nature of the market at that time. And we know the biscuits were produced by 100, this is 1967, 110 producers in Italy. The 72% of them was situated in the north. So very fragmented market, and the majority of these biscuits were sold in local retailers. Only like 20% in 1967 were sold in more organized shops, like the supermarkets of the time. And it was a very national market as well, so there was very little import-export. So Italians were really consuming the biscuits produced in Italy. And this is going to be very important later on. Also, this kind of market didn't have any strong leader. So all the big brands, let's say, used to have around 10-12% of the market share, with very special focus in certain areas. So you had some biscuit varieties like Oro Sava, which is an Italian staple, that had alone almost the 40% of the market of dry biscuits. So there was like local institutions. So each kind of biscuit reflected a different moment of consumption. And this is a very interesting document from 1973 from a national survey that was run to understand how Italians were consuming biscuits at that time. And we have the different varieties, so like dry biscuits, frollini, egg-based, filled biscuits, amaretti and wafers, and divided according to breakfast, afternoon snack, or if offered to guests or in other occasions. And we can see how the dry biscuits basically were, like the consumption of dry biscuit was heavy during breakfast. And indeed, we know that the majority of these biscuits were actually fed to children. So the idea was that dry biscuits were really healthy, maybe not that gratifying, but good for children, very nutritious. On the other hand, we had follini, so this like lighter version of the shortbread that were a little bit more, a little bit richer, a little bit more gratifying, and they were consumed like a little bit in between breakfast and as a snack. And they were also part of the hospitality ritual, so they were likely to be offered to guests as well. Why is this important? This is important because what Mulino Bianco did was shifting how these biscuits actually ended up being distributed in the daily consumption. So I need to talk to you a little bit about this game changer. Mulino Bianco was launched in 1975 by a bigger brand, Barilla, who is a pasta producer. The reason why Barilla decided to venture into this spin-off, creating a brand out of the blue really, was because at that time because of the Kippur War, there was a cap. The price of oil and of course of raw materials was increasing, and so the national government decided to cap the prices of staple products, among them pasta. So Barilla decided to go into another direction, and bakery was considered like a very suitable industry where to look into for two reasons. One was flour, so the raw material was in line with the Barilla company, but also because of certain growth. We know that in 1974, so before this brand arrived on the shelves, 1974, biscuit consumption, the overall consumption increased of 17% in comparison to the previous year. So clearly it was a category where there was still a lot of potential. So what this brand does is coming into the market with this brand image that is really linked to a sort of Arcadia. So it's a white, these are the actual print advertisements from the 70s. Is that white mill into an isolated valley in the countryside, somehow reminiscent of the past. And I want you to focus on the materiality of the products per se. Irregular shaped biscuits, very round shaped as well, that had this sort of very tactile feeling of a product that could be sort of artisanal or artisanally inspired. Of course, Italian consumers were aware that this was an industrial product, but there was this sort of connection to the industrial past. And this was also the original, they started to sell in this kind of pack that was very unusual by the time. Before, biscuit used to be sold in boxes, so very square, very rigid, very efficient. This instead was very brave, because on one hand it had this emotional feeling of something that was much more, again, artisanal, could remind of the brown bag of the baker. But on the other hand, they had to work a lot on the pack to make sure that the biscuits inside wouldn't crumble. And even if they did, they knew that they would have leveraged on those feelings of recalling the past. So this is actually, I translated one of the ads. Do you remember those biscuits that used to taste of butter, milk, and wheat? Tomorrow morning, look for them at the white mill. And of course, Italians had no idea about those biscuits that taste of butter, milk, and wheat, because they had never existed before. Actually, what Mulino Bianco did was he hired a British baker called George Maxwell, who tested the recipes for the Italian market. So the know-how behind it was actually not even Italian. By doing so, however, Mulino Bianco, and you can tell, tomorrow morning, look for them at the white mill, Mulino Bianco consistently markets the biscuits towards breakfast consumption. So start shifting the moment of consumption towards breakfast, and it does also appeal not only to children that you don't see anymore, but to the overall family. And we know actually that the penetration of biscuits started to be more and more to be higher in families without children. To give you an idea, so these are the data of 5-year difference. So they entered the market in 1975. By 1980, Mulino Bianco was already the leader in the marketplace, and that's fine. But what I'm really interested is the shift in consumption habits. So on one hand, we do have a drop in the biscuit production overall in Italy. So we can see how Forlini is now much more important in terms of overall production in Italy, because of course competitors started to tag along as well, but also of the value of the market, right? So now we have dry biscuits being less and less relevant. So on one hand then, Mulino Bianco managed to replace dry biscuits through a very a more fulfilling product that also had these sort of regressive meanings, echoing an idealized past. Mulino Bianco managed to position Forlini as an everyday product for the whole family, and especially for breakfast. So by 1980, by the way, now Forlini, before the 40% of Forlini was consumed at breakfast. In 1981, the 77% of Forlini is consumed at breakfast. So actually, there is a significant shift. But then we talk about breakfast. So what do we know about breakfast in Italy at that time? And again, the point is very little. There are very few data on what Italians used to eat at that time. On one hand, we know from some anthropologists that probably peasants or farmers or the working class used to have leftovers from the night before, cheese, maybe some polenta, while the middle class already had access to milk and coffee. And these are just some data that I took from Versamani on the boom of milk and coffee between 1951 and 1971, because these are the other two products that we consider fundamental for the Italian breakfast. But another survey in 1973 tells us that only 1/3 of the Italian population used to eat something before leaving the house. So what Italians used to have, the traditional Italian breakfast, was really just a cup of coffee for the majority of adults. And there is a really interesting article from 1978 that tells us that it was quite normal for children around 12 years old to stop having breakfast altogether. So once children would let's say enter middle school, they would stop having breakfast. What we know, and we don't have time for this, but what we know is that at that point, Italian society starts having a bit of a identity crisis on this topic, because after like the boom of biscuit consumption, we know that Italians started to consume breakfast more and more, but then they were not like this kind of breakfast, right? Like biscuit, milk, coffee really had no place inside the Italian culture, and especially inside the Italian meal pattern. And this is where the second level of my research on Italian breakfast comes in. That is the construction of a legitimizing narrative around the brand and around the practice. Sorry. So we know that. You probably follow me on this one. Italians started to be very regular breakfast consumers, but not really aware if the kind of breakfast they were having was legitimate or not. And indeed, like especially in the late 80s, new kinds of breakfast started to come into the Italian marketplace. And Kellogg's, for instance, started to market really heavily, but also yogurt. That wasn't a very common product back at the time. And there are actually interesting campaigns of yogurt producers trying to push in. So Mulino Bianco decides to create a campaign on Italian breakfast, and the Italian breakfast campaign lasted between 1992 and 1996. And the structure of the campaign is determined by a new partner that is Media Italia. Meditalia is used to be, actually doesn't exist anymore, used to be a PR company, a spin-off of the advertising company Armando Testa. And the way Mulino Bianco got to know Meditalia was through another campaign, the one on sugar. Like, for those who don't speak Italian, it says sugar is full of life. And this was another campaign run at the beginning of the 80s to actually rehabilitate the image of sugar among Italian consumers. For that occasion, sugar producers had hired Media Italia to do something about it. And Media Italia had created a scientific committee where nutritionists from the Italian Nutritional Institute, but also like other members of physicians, other nutritional institutions, they would cooperate to research simple and complex carbohydrates. And the results of these research would then be delivered to journalists and to the media. So that worked really well, and Mulino Bianco decides to replicate the experiment for the Italian breakfast. So what they started to do was to produce a series, this series of research that was published into very dedicated journals. The scientific committee was called FOSAN, and they had a bulletin of journal of their own that would publish this kind of research, so for the professionals. But the the data reached the public through a very intense coverage through Mondadori, and especially Mondadori, but also through other publishers, quite big at the time. And of course, women's magazine were highly targeted for this campaign. And the overall point of the campaign was that indeed breakfast had this kind of breakfast, so based on convenience, bakery products, was legitimate, was healthy, was nutritionally valid, and it also had a place into the collective national identity, because it would use those carbohydrates that were part of the Mediterranean diet. So it tapped into that conversation, and in a way echoed to this sense of a tradition that was already there, but I showed you that was not there at all. And of course, there are some underlying narratives as well, for instance, about the idea of not having breakfast not as an extra burden in the morning, but actually a moment to take care of yourself. So you can see these two adults having jogging in the morning because you have all the time in the world, so why not having breakfast as well? But also they start, this media coverage starts to enforce the role of breakfast in children performances. So, and of course you can see how there are the nutritional information. So on one hand, the narrative of the Italian tradition, and on the other, the legitimization from the scientific research. I just want to conclude. So this campaign lasted for 5 years. It ended in 1996. We have data from 1995 that show how the majority of Italians at that point was aware of the term Italian breakfast, and they would associate that to this specific model. I will also want to share with you, I forgot about this one. It was quite interesting how the breakfast that by experience was not a family meal was then associated to family meanings. And look, I just want to show the narrative of the family sat down together with a tablecloth, everyone sharing the food. So actually don't see the packaging, you see the display of the food. So tapping into this sort of traditional narrative, like the proper middle class family. So the way lunch is done can be the same way in which breakfast is done. And I just wanted to share with you the campaign closed in 1996. This is the last conference that was held for journalist in 1996, and the title of the conference was "Have Italian Added a Meal onto Their Table?" And I think that this actually comes from one of the leaflets that was handed out at the conference, and I think it spells out really well what the campaign was after. The traditional Italian breakfast satisfies this somehow conscious tension to rediscover domestic, intimate, almost maternal values when we wake up. Maybe the range will broaden, but the traditional model will stay as the reference for a consumption that will answer a private, intimate, personal, yet conscious need. A morning space, simple and secure, granted by objective quality, by the convenience of an added service, by modernity and innovation, all of this granted by the value of the brand. So while in the conference it's never spelled out clearly what brand are we talking about, of course Mulino Bianco sponsored the whole thing. So I hope that you enjoyed this overview, and what is really important to try and convey how the emplacement of this Italian tradition indeed require a lot of marketplace innovation as well, especially through the innovation of the Frulini biscuit. Thank you.
I propose we open the biscuits. And
let's do it. So for those that are not used to that, you realize how they are much drier than what you're probably used to when you think about shortbreads, because they need to serve the purpose of soaking up the milk. So thank you. And in terms of design, every biscuit is meant to represent something linked to the mill. So this is one of the wheels of the mill, and you can tell that in terms of tactile feeling, you have this sense of something that crumbles, that is not regular, that has not an entirely industrial product, but something that could be in between.
A bit rough.
Yeah. You can taste like shortbread, kind of. It's almost shortbread, but not quite, kind of thing. Far away from Dan.
Yes, thank you so much. Fantastic presentation. Made me think about many of the things I was used to watch on TV when I was a kid. And actually, this question comes with my own experience with Mulino Bianco as someone that grew up with this type of tradition. You focused a lot on biscuits. As, of course, a shift to try to implement this Frulini from the 70s. This is actually partially a curiosity, but partially to try to understand if that was a challenge when they introduced merendine, which is like industrial version of a pain à chocolat pack. And did they went through the same process, a kind of a rebranding themselves, but without competing with the existing market that they already acquired?
The market of the snacks happened actually 10 years after they launched. So at that point, they were like quite an established brand, and they already had that. Also, something I want to mention is not just entirely brand identity. Like these guys were benefiting of another much bigger industry. They were benefiting from the distribution of another industry. So they really had that sort of shelf space that would grant them a lot of exposure. But for instance, in the merendine that happened afterwards, they were applying the same logic of wholesome products. So the idea that would be something authentic, there would be something like where the ingredients were carefully selected. And it also happened in a time in which the narrative about industrial products was very different. Of course, then they suffered in the early 90s about the decline, and especially the sort of the popular opinion that was really critical against these kind of products. But at the very beginning, they were actually they were like surfing the wave of what they had done in the 70s. Yeah.
Well, it's maybe a bit of a whole other world of question, but you mentioned right at the beginning of having finished that they need to be somewhat dry to soak up the milk, and I think that for me was kind of the biggest revelation of staying with families in Italy some years ago for the first time, that like nothing is sort of off limits for dunking in your milk or coffee in the morning. You know, that's a sort of staple of the kind of practice. And I suppose I was wondering, like, where that sits in your knowledge, at least in terms of the Italian breakfast tradition, because to me that seems like, if anything, almost more quintessential of like contemporary Italian breakfast than anything else is the action, because that in my upbringing, at least here, was sort of like, I mean, of course, chocolate for breakfast was also unusual for me, but like, you know, being allowed to just dunk anything in there, like that, you know, that to me always seemed like a very unique thing.
Well spotted, because I forgot to mention this. In what we know, again, it's very hard to say what happened at breakfast because there are very few data about what actually people were doing at breakfast. But one of the staples of Italian breakfast across, I would say, working class and even middle class, was stale bread soaked in milk. So this was considered to be a very healthy kind of breakfast that everyone could have, and actually was really interesting in the data from 1973 that housewives, how they were called at that time, housewives would serve that and they would be actually happy to have that. They were like, really, it was considered even like a gratifying thing. The survey that was run in late 1980 instead already reported how Italians consider that a sign of poverty, like having stale bread in the morning was not acceptable anymore. But exactly what he stayed was the practice of soaking something. So this is where the innovation of the biscuit was crucial, because they managed to do with the Forlini what had used to be done with the dry biscuits, right? Dry biscuits are meant to soak things up. These kind of biscuits could do the same, but they were much richer, much more gratifying. Yeah.
And sorry to continue
please.
that question, but I've always wondered if it was like predated also the like war times, that stale bread in your morning milk or cafe latte or whatever kind of tradition, because I first read about it in a sort of wartime context, and like people you know, on the run, say during the war, found themselves staying, you know, British soldiers and things, found themselves staying with local families in you know, the mountains across Italy, and came across this tradition. But I was wondering.
No, I think that definitely probably something that goes way before but also it was something that was not only for breakfast. So zuppa di latte, the soup of milk, was something that was available. Everyone had those who had a cow probably would have that also for dinner at times, because that was what was available.
Okay, so nutritional science is not an exact science.
No.
However, just to address the elephant in the room, that is maybe not particularly healthy to have a lot of sugar in the morning, were there also kind of critical voices of this type of kind of commercially co-opted Italian breakfast tradition?
So this is something that I would love to look into, going back to the magazines actually. I know that the most critical voices were the associations of consumers that were actually, you know, trying to be more vocal about these kind of issues. I can tell you that there was a book by Yudkin that was came out in 1972 in English, so it arrived in the Italian marketplace much later, saying how sugar was basically poison. And that influenced heavily even the Italian marketplace and Italian consumers. However, this kind of something I didn't spell out clearly is that these were not forced research. So the researchers were working anyway on sugar and carbohydrates, and to be honest, they were they were saying your brain needs sugar and you would need carbohydrates as well. So if part of a balanced diet, it's fine to have that kick in the morning that would keep you going, especially if you combine it with protein and so on and so forth. The brand leverage on this fact that despite Italians were believed, for instance, that the breakfast based on yogurt was more modern and more healthy, they wouldn't have it. So they were aware of the nutritional facts, but they still like sat back in this idea of the maternal values when you wake up. So actually the whole interplay between the marketplace and this consumption is very psychological as well. There are a lot of the marketplace researchers that actually look into this aspect of consumption, being nurtured in the morning, making sure that you start in the easiest, coziest way, and sugars tapped very well into that narrative.
I mean, it's maybe less of a question, but thoughts on that, which is that I think, you know, maybe more traditional breakfasts in other parts of Europe, I'm questioning traditional now more and more, but you know, things like porridge and oat-based things and stuff, I can imagine that maybe being quite badly received in Italy. Well, I think still to some extent in terms of like attitudes, kind of relates to your talk on rough grains and things, you know, and in terms of like having a processed grain product as opposed to something that obviously more nutritionally that, you know, full value as we know now, but like that, yeah, you were saying with the carbohydrates and the Mediterranean tradition and things, I think.
Yeah, but there was also something, and this would be a different and very interesting piece of work to do. There was a sort of a challenge between different breakfasts, right? So there was the English breakfast, in especially media around the 80s and 90s, was considered like a very, you know, almost like a meal with its own status. So it had its own value, and Italians were almost looking up at that kind of tradition where you could sit down and have a cooked breakfast, you know, would have been ideal but not part of what we do. And the same is true for the sort of what it was considered like beyond the Alps kind of breakfast, so muesli and yogurt and all these kind of things. Already the fact that there existed these traditions was something where, I don't know, they created a sense of Italian, like of identity crisis, right? Like Italians had nothing to compete against. And indeed, like what they're doing with the campaign is saying, well, Italian breakfast is better than the English one. Italian breakfast has the same dignity of the French one. So you better choose your biscuits against your croissants, these kind of things. So then it actually became, rather than on the nutritional side, like a more international, a gastro-nationalism kind of thing.
Does this play, how successful is this across Italy? Is it the same everywhere, or differs? Because that's also a theme of Cristiano's talk as well, of talking about the different traditions and how they're brought together or merged in some way.
So far, I have no data on how the consumption differed between the north and the south. So this is something I cannot tell. I can say with a fair, that this, especially because of we're talking about the late 70s, so the media use like press, TV, were now fairly spread throughout the peninsula. But this has become a sort of like an ideal national model. Of course, if you're probably bordering the north of